So you will all be stars on this. Okay, I'm dismissing this. You've all been told. Okay, so I will cover, if you have any questions from period 3, we went over a lot of 2 and 3 on Monday, I think it was. And so if you have a question near the end of that, go ahead and ask, but I'm going to try to move on to kind of do a little bit more 4, but especially 5. I have a feeling there's going to be something on this, maybe the end of the 1800s, but going into period 4 and period 5, it just seems like that would be a good place to go. Part of what they're doing on the AP exam is they're trying to figure out some era that all of you have covered, or everybody around the country has covered. And since school started shutting down in March, they really don't know how much of detail they got into, the last few units. So even, Great Depression or World War II, some school districts might have trouble getting that. Doesn't mean they won't ask a question on that, but I'm just guessing it's going to be somewhere before. And so, we'll see. But you should have information on that. And that's also part of the reason why it's only 1 DBQ and it's 45 minutes. So you can't look up answers or things on the online because you won't have time to type it or do it. And as I understand it, they're really going to aggressively check if you try to take it from someplace else. Oop, I'm getting a message. All right, I'm already getting questions. All right, that's what I like to see. And so, yeah, we will do the end of Reconstruction. We will do all that, but let me give one more quick announcement. So anybody who wants to redo part of your DBQ, I've graded them. I gave a lot of comments, but on the DBQ we did on the dropping of the atomic bomb. The biggest issue I had was outside information. And so before I answer any question, you have to get more outside information. Even if you got over a 90%, which I think you've done very well, I still think you should get more outside information. But if anybody wants to give a chance for a few extra points on that, if you give me an outline, the outline basically just so I can see that you're organized, but then 2 paragraphs, your opening paragraph with context, background material, thesis, and then 1 of your body paragraphs. So you give an example of showing how you did that. If you give me that by Monday, I'll give you a chance to get more points because I think almost everybody read the documents pretty well. I think almost everybody understood how to organize it for the most part. Those of you who didn't, who got below an 80, I put down marks, I think why I thought there were issues with it. But I'll give you that chance because everybody over an 80, I thought had a very good chance of passing. Just the lower on that scale was a lack of outside information. All right, so let's start going over some things. I'll stop halfway through, give you a sample, and then we'll keep going. And so I'm just going to go right in order. Oh, we got something from Tariff and Hamilton. I will do that one, even though that's on page. Is that on page 2? But that's such a big deal. Let's go ahead and get Tariff and Hamilton really quick. The big thing about Hamilton was, and this would be one of the divides, so the Federalists wanted this, Hamilton wanted a high protective tariff with the idea that this would keep out foreign competition. Remember, a tariff is a tax on imports. So he wanted a high protective tariff to encourage U.S. manufacturing. There was virtually no manufacturing at all at the beginning of the United States. He wanted to encourage manufacturing and industry, but tariffs raise all prices and have a potential to raise profits for manufacturers. And so because of this, Jefferson and Madison were opposed to it. And therefore, that would be the main plank of the Republican Party. This only protected the very wealthy. Just one sec. It's a little dark in here. And it's still dark in here. There we go. Just trying to get a little more light on me. But they never passed the high protective tariff, just a small tariff called a revenue tariff. But this would go into Clay's American System and all the way up to the 1970s. And then it's back again with President Trump. Okay, the next one. Can we do the end of Reconstruction? Yes, we can. And so that's a good one. And that goes all the way to page something or rather. But it's the end of period 5. So that's a good one to do. And so I can't even see what page that is. For some reason, my page, but I think it's page 4. Does that sound right to you? And End of Reconstruction and the Compromise of 1877. And so don't forget Reconstruction, and the big Reconstruction you have to get is two up from End of Reconstruction. That's Congressional Reconstruction. So remember, Reconstruction was an attempt to bring equal rights and economic rights to former slaves while bringing the South back into the Union. And Reconstruction ended because of these reasons. First off, Redeemer governments began to establish. Finally, Southern whites realized we have no choice, and so they began to allow themselves to come back into the Union and accept Congressional Reconstruction. But once Redeemer governments took power, they began to take away rights from former slaves. The second big reason, the North was growing tired of Reconstruction. It seemed like the war had been going on now for 2 decades, and they were growing tired. And there was a significant amount of racism in the North anyways. And so they thought, well, why should we give rights to former slaves? Next, there was the Panic of 1873. Excuse me. And this economic disaster led a lot of people in the North to think, we have our own problems. Why should we worry about the South anymore? And the really big reason why the Republican Party was making a big shift to being the pro-business party, away from free labor and workers' rights and the party of equality to more just pro-business. And they wanted allies in Southern Democrats, thinking, okay, we'll give you control. You can do whatever you want in the South, but allow us to have our tariffs. Allow us to have the gold standard. And so Republicans are making a deal that they would rather give up equal rights for Southern backing in some of their pro-business policies. And the Compromise of 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican who lost in the popular vote, but remember that doesn't matter. He and the Democrat, Samuel Tilden, both claimed electoral votes from 3 states, the last 3 states with military reconstruction, Florida, South Carolina, and Louisiana. So those 3 states. And basically the compromise was this. Southern Democrats agreed to allow Hayes to have the delegates or the electors from all 3 states. He got all 3 states and won by 1 electoral vote. But in return, the North began to consciously end Reconstruction. It would take about a decade, but they ended it. And so that's the Compromise of 1877. So this noble effort to bring equal rights to all people would fail. Reconstruction then would become, you get the whole myth of Reconstruction and the lost cause and everything else. Next, the divide over capitalism. Let's go up, and that's on the bottom of page. I hope everyone can see this as I scroll through, but for some reason it doesn't change the pages on it. So the bottom of page 3. Oh God, the page numbers on. It's a long day, and it's 1041. So the divide over capitalism. These were the differing views on what capitalism was doing, especially the wage system. So this was a disagreement on the wage system. And remember the big thing about capitalism, the capitalist, the person who invests in the capital, they take the risk and they have to have the initiative, the ingenuity, the innovation, whatever to make it, but they get all the profits. And don't forget, in capitalism, which is the way it is today, wages are not tied to profits. And if you don't believe me, look at places like Amazon. But free labor was the ideology of the Whig Party. And what it said was this: the ideology of the Whig Party. That said, that believed capitalism was a good thing, and they felt part of it. They thought capitalism was creating this dynamic system, so free labor was pro-capitalism. But it basically said that workers have all kinds, or workers, regular people, have all kinds of opportunity in capitalism. And they could work at any factory, any job they want, and if they don't like it, they can quit. That's the great thing about it. They can quit and get another job. Or maybe someday, if they work hard and show enough creativity and ingenuity, they could become the capitalists themselves. So free labor was the concept that capitalism is a good thing and workers are free to decide their own fate. And this would become the ideology of the North before the Civil War. Wage slavery was the view that capitalism and the wage system was trapping or virtually enslaving workers. And so this was the view of people who felt left out of capitalism, that capitalism was leaving them behind. And I should add, it wasn't so much that everybody was a wage earner yet, but they could see the future. And if you don't know what's going to happen, it's really scary. And so a lot of Democrats believe this, and it believed that workers were trapped in jobs they could not leave. They could not take advantage of the innovation or creativity of capitalism because they'll never have enough money. They'll have to accept whatever working conditions they can get because they have no choice, because if they don't accept it, they'll starve. So capitalism is creating slaves. And this kind of goes back to the Jeffersonian or Jackson idea. So there are differing views on capitalism, this new system. And these views go on to this day. Next, we have Nat Turner's Rebellion. Oh, that's a big one. That's a big one. Never let me say that again. Where's it at here? Yeah. So it's up to number 3. We talked about slavery. I talked a lot about slave resistance in class, and that was about running away in the Underground Railroad, which we have on the other side, but also acting like a cuffie, where they've been cuffed into submission, where they will act like a slave is supposed to act, but then turn around and then sabotage. So that was a big example. Break stuff, do things that we don't want to mention into the soup, things like that, and deprive them of their labor. But the biggest example of slave resistance, and the one that scared everybody, an overwhelming fear of slave rebellion. And in 1831 in Virginia, Nat Turner, a slave, would start a rebellion that would end up killing over 50 people. And the big thing about slave rebellions, slaves know exactly what's going to happen to them if they rebel. So they take no prisoners, and any slaves that rebel will be made an example of. And so Nat Turner and over 200 other slaves would be either killed while putting down the rebellion, or they would have a trial, which is so weird to have a trial when they claim that slaves are property. But Virginia was trying to show we are civilized, but everybody knew he was going to be found guilty and hanged. And so Nat Turner's rebellion. But it was in 1831. It was just as the Industrial Revolution was beginning. It was just as the abolitionist movement. In fact, William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, the first major abolitionist newspaper, came out just a few months before this. And so Nat Turner's rebellion terrified the South. And that led to a series of laws. And you have to get this down, the Nat Turner Laws. And the Nat Turner Laws were the most strict slave codes that restricted education of slaves because they might read abolitionist material. It made them all have some kind of like a little tag or something to show that they're a slave. We would call them an internal passport in the last 100 years, and like a driver's license. And strengthened the militias. But Southerners blamed abolitionists for this. They blamed abolitionists inciting them. And that is going to be such an important issue that will lead to the feelings of the South in fear of slave rebellion. It's no coincidence that a year and a half after this would be the nullification crisis and Calhoun trying to unify the South to protect slavery. It's no coincidence at all. and slave rebellion, that fear would lead to the Texas annexation issue. It's such a big deal. Okay, Wilmot Proviso. Go to the next page. So we're on page 4, and I'm trying to find it here. Okay, it's on page 4, the Wilmot Proviso, and that is arguably that is the most famous law that was never passed. The Wilmot Proviso was a proviso or an amendment proposed in the House to a bill to pay for the Mexican War. All proviso means is an amendment. And it was done by David Wilmot, who is a free soil Democrat from Pennsylvania. And it said no slavery in any territory from Mexico we would get from Mexico, meaning no slavery in the Mexican cession. Remember that term, Mexican cession. And to Southerners, this was an act of war. It's going to not allow for Southern expansion. They will be outnumbered in the Senate and not have senatorial balance, so slavery might be chipped away in the Senate. Remember, the Southerners' big strategy was for years since the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, was to keep the number of slave states and free states equal to keep balance in the Senate. And the other thing is, by confining slaves to just the South, the Southeast, you're condemning the South to slave rebellion. But what really made them scared was it passed the House and failed in the Senate. And so everybody just freaked out. And they would vote on this some 47 times over 2 years. And this became the issue. And so that is why you get with the Mexican War, the issue that defined the election of 1848 and would define years to come. To Southerners, this is an example of the North trying to condemn them to the hells of slave rebellion and destroy them. And to the South, they thought this is trying to condemn them to the hells of slave rebellion. In the North, they saw this as Southern bullying. It did not pass. Okay, next one, Marbury versus Madison. And that's on the top of page 3, the top of page 3. And that's the Marshall Court, and that's the most important court decision in American history. Marbury versus Madison said that the Supreme Court has the power of judicial review. They could check the constitutionality of laws. Nowhere in the Constitution does it say that. Nowhere. The Supreme Court gave themselves that power. Now, it's going to be 50 or 60 years, meaning the end of the Civil War, where people would become to accept this. But today, we just accept that the Supreme Court has this immense power. And nowhere does it say that. And the amazing thing is, it's really hard to question this immense power, because any law that might question the Supreme Court having this power must go to the Supreme Court. But this is the most important decision. And that's why eventually Gibbons versus Ogden, which is a little further down, that also said one of the things is that the Supreme Court can look at the action of state laws to see if they're constitutional. And that's why that's important. Now, remember, it's going to take 50 or 60 years for the government to really accept this. But this is the way we look at it today. In fact, there was a big ruling today that came out about the Supreme Court overturning some people, a government official convicted in New Jersey. So it's right today. It's a big issue. Immigration and the Irish. So that's near. Sorry, you got to watch me look at this. I know it's fun. Where the heck is it at? Am I just totally missing this? I can't find it. And I made the thing. Just imagine I'm finding the immigration in the Irish. It's on page 4. Of course it's on page 4. Oh, Jesus, right near. Okay. Immigration in the Irish. And beginning at the end of the 1830s, but going into the end of the 1840s, there was a massive wave of immigration. immigration to the United States, partially triggered by the growth of the Industrial Revolution into Europe. As industrialization and capitalism came into Europe, there became people kicked off the land, and so they were literally starving, and their only choices were to go to the city and take the odds now, or take a chance in the new wage system that's happening all over Europe, or go to America. So you see that wave of immigration happening, combined with a few other things to avoid the draft. And a lot of immigrants were coming from places, this new wave of immigration in the 1830s, they were not coming from England. They were coming from Ireland and other places in Europe, especially southern Germany. Ireland and southern Germany. And one of the big things about it was they were Catholic immigrants with different different cultural elements that made them different than the Americans, the citizens of the United States that are already there. But the other thing was, and it really affected the Irish a lot, but it also affected all over Europe. At the same time as this Industrial Revolution happened, the same exact time, the beginning of the early 1840s was a massive famine. And the famine was triggered by a potato blight, a fungus that affected potatoes. This was worldwide, a worldwide famine caused by potatoes. But because the poor and Irish, who were so mistreated by the English colonists, they relied upon the potatoes for their entire livelihood. That was their entire diet. And so over a million Irish would starve to death, and millions of Irish immigrants came to the United States, and that led to nativism. But don't forget, this was a worldwide famine. Affected everything. It's just that Ireland, it was the worst. Next. Wow, we have a lot of them here. Corrupt Bargain of 1824. So let's go up to page 3. The Corrupt Bargain. And the Corrupt Bargain was the election of 1824. 4 people wanted to run for president. 4 people were running. And even though they are all technically Republicans, it showed that this so-called era of good feelings in only one political party was actually an illusion. But the 2 main ones who got the most popular votes, this is the first election where there's large numbers of voters choosing electors, and had the greatest number of electoral votes were John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. But neither had the majority in electoral Congress. That means it went to the House of Representatives. And Henry Clay, who also wanted to be president, he was the Speaker of the House, and he, through his considerable influence, to Adams. Adams just a sec, I'm missing something here. Adams would win in the House of Representatives, and he would make Henry Clay his Secretary of State. To everybody, and Adams had been Secretary of State to Monroe. Monroe was Secretary of State, and so on. So it seemed like Adams was anointing his successor. And so there was a bargain. Clay supports Adams, and then Adams will make Clay the next president. Jackson's supporters said this was a corrupt bargain, and this shows how corrupt the elites were. And so that's I'm just having a little trouble with my camera. But that shows you how corrupt the elites were. And now Clay would have supported Adams anyways. He supported his American system. But, sorry, I lost everybody now. This is so weird. All right, next. But you see the beginnings of the parties, the Democrats and the anti-Democrats coming soon to be called the Whigs. So we got horizontal and vertical trust. Let's go to page, where we at here? That's got to be pretty, that's got to be on page 6, doesn't it? Yeah. No, page 5, I'm sorry. So page 5, horizontal and vertical trust. Another term for trust, you might see it as integration. Sometimes you might see them as horizontal and vertical monopolies, but horizontal and vertical trust became synonymous with monopolies. And so this is where the beginnings of where one corporation would begin to take control of other corporations, and eventually trust became equal to monopolies. So make sure we get that. Trust equals monopolies. But they were different ways to organize companies. A horizontal trust or horizontal monopoly was owning all the alike industries, like John Rockefeller trying to own all the oil refineries. That is a horizontal trust. When we think of a monopoly, we think horizontal. So if anybody wanted to sell their crude oil to a refinery or buy refined oil, they had to go to John Rockefeller. So he could set the price. That is what we think of a monopoly. An example of a monopoly today would be Amazon or Google. They are a horizontal monopoly. They're also vertical. A vertical monopoly is another way to do it. And this would be to own all elements of production. And so own from the bottom to the top of production. For example, Andrew Carnegie, he owned the coal, the iron mines. He made deals to control the railroads that shipped it to the steel mills that he owned, and then he owned the distribution. So from the bottom of the production, all the elements, all the way to the top. And so that's vertical. And those are the two examples of one. So there are two different ways to do monopolies. And so you see that with a big one is in media. They will today, like Netflix not only has the distribution, but Netflix also is now owning many of the shows they sell and the production companies that do it from the bottom up. That's different types of monopolies. Next, nativist. So the natives do know nothing party, that goes up to page 4. Now I know where that's at. It's right next to the new immigration. And the nativist means that they're anti-immigration. Nativists are anti-immigration. They don't want any new immigrants to the United States. Now, of course, everybody of European descent in the United States is an immigrant, but they didn't see it that way. They're the true Americans. So they see themselves as true Americans. And anybody else coming in is not real Americans. And their big reasons were twofold. Number one was there was a fear that immigrants might drive down wages. And in the short run, that could happen, especially immigrants that feel they might be sent back. They do take lower wages because they're scared. And so they might drop wages in the short run. I have to be very clear. In the long run, immigration, at least historically, has dramatically raised wages because it's increased the size of the market, more productivity, more things to be sold. But they're fearful of losing their jobs. And secondly, it's some kind of prejudice. It's racism or prejudice in some way. The nativists at the 1840s were incredibly anti-Catholic. They feared Catholic immigration. These Catholics were of different cultures. So they worship different, they talk different, they drank differently. All these things, there's something different about them. And so they feared that difference. And so this is the idea of nativists. The thing is, tie them both together. They're fearful of losing their place in society. For most people, we don't have much. We don't have much, but I don't want to lose a little if I have. It's somebody from below might come. This should remind you a lot of racism. It's very of the elements of racism that I talked about since Bacon's Rebellion. The Know Nothing Party, also called the American Party, that would be a nativist political party that in 1856 looked like they might actually become the second party. When the Whigs fell apart, it was between the Republicans and the Know Nothings, and they did fairly well. But most of the Know Nothing Party would be rolled into the Republicans. Next, new immigration, Ellis Island. So that must be on page 5. Yep, near the bottom of page 5. New immigration and Ellis Island. And so what that is is this is the wave of the new immigration into the United States, beginning especially in the 1880s, all the way through to the end of World War I. The new immigration. And the big thing about the new immigrants, oops, just a sec, I got to change something. This was a different wave of immigrants, and they were more from Central and Eastern Europe, or a significant number of immigrants from Japan or China. But so if you think about what I just said about the Irish immigrants, even more culturally different. And even though, looking back at it, all the amazing changes that helped our society, they just one sec, I got to change something on my screen. Huh. There is a hand raising. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so back to this. So they were culturally different, and a significant number of these new immigrants were Jews. And so this is where, like I said before, not only was this the most racist time in American history, this was also the most anti-Semitic time. Not just, everyone thinks, oh, it's just only Germany. No, it's all over the world, including the United States. And millions of immigrants would be coming to the United States. There was very few restrictions on immigrants, and a significant number would come through New York because it was the largest harbor in the United States at that time. And Ellis Island would be a place where millions of immigrants would be processed. And if you ever get a chance, go to Ellis Island in New York City. But this became, too many people, too many new citizens of the United States, their first chance to get to the United States. I have a couple ancestors, like many people, ancestors from all over the world, and including the United States. So let's get to Southern ideology and the positive good theory. We kind of hinted at that, but that goes to the middle of page 5. Is that right? Is that 5? Middle page 4, I'm sorry. The middle of page 4. And Southern ideology, and this revolved around John C. Calhoun's positive good theory of slavery. And this is the concept that slavery was a good thing. And there's no reason for Southerners to feel bad about slavery, because slavery was actually civilizing the slaves. It was civilizing the slaves. Without slavery, the freedmen, the former slaves, would not be able to care for themselves, and they will either drop into poverty and starve, or that since they are uncivilized, they will become savages and commit crimes. And the big one they really hit was they would rape. The rape was one that they would start. That would be the one they just hammered on over and over again, and then also spread diseases and things like that. But that was the idea. And so slavery was actually a good thing because it is civilizing people. And the next one, it is natural. There has always been slavery with one group on top and one group on the bottom. And that is people, the small, tiny group of elite who run things and know how things are going, and those on the bottom who work. And this is the natural way that it's supposed to be. And it is very racialized at this time. Whites are on top because they are supposed to be, and that's the natural way. And those who are not white, but in this context, people of African descent, are on the bottom. That is natural. Why? Because they are inferior. They are not quite subhuman, but pretty close. That was the concept of it. The beginning of racialized science. And it was working. They were making a lot of money, so they didn't want to get rid of it. It's so profitable. Why would you ever want to get rid of it? But the other big element was, in the North, white workers are being treated like slaves, aka wage slavery. White workers are being treated like that. And not only is that unnatural, you treat white workers like that and they will rebel. So slavery is a good thing because it's protecting the world from rebellion. Heck, positive good theory by the 1850s would say we treat our workers better than white capitalists treat their workers. Now, of course, this is garbage, but it's to justify slavery. Next. Okay, let's get right into the causes of the Civil War. And so the causes of the Civil War. And okay, when we look at the causes, now don't forget, this goes back to all of these issues that are led behind. This is kind of piling them all together. So think about this whole series of events that happen from the Missouri Compromise and Manifest Destiny and annexation of Texas, Wilmot Proviso, Compromise of 1850, Bleeding Kansas. So you get that point. It's all number of things. But the causes of the Civil War, why it happened then, right then, was that the biggest issue was the election of Abraham Lincoln absolutely terrified Southern Democrats. They looked at it as Lincoln will be able to create a Republican Party in the South. There was no Republican Party in the South. And Lincoln will be able to create a Southern Republican Party. And a Southern ideology. One thing I totally forgot to mention about Southern ideology. I'm sorry, it just popped in my mind. But Southerners thought Northerners were trying to trigger a slave rebellion. This goes back to Nat Turner. So I did mention this, but they thought that. And the most feared abolitionist who talked about slave rebellion was John Brown. And so Southerners looked at Northerners as all being John Browns. And so if you have an election and you elect a Republican, that will create, he will start appointing government jobs to a new Republican Party in the South, and that will put a bunch of John Browns in the South, and that will trigger their greatest fear, a slave rebellion. So that was the that was the trigger. If we don't do it now, if we allow the election of a John Brown Republican, slave rebellion, we're doomed. And so what it gets to then, the causes of the Civil War, was that Southern ideology. The Southern ideology. All these things were building up to it. And let's be very clear. What did it all stem to then? The last thing? The protection of slavery. They feared slavery. They said it, they made it very clear. They saw free soil Republicans as all secret John Browns, and they're going to destroy slavery and condemn them to slave rebellion. So, but don't forget, if you look at these stepping stones to it, if let's say there's an essay that asks that, some examples of that would be, Dred Scott, John Brown, free soil ideology, Bleeding Kansas, and so on. Next question. Where are we at here? Beginning of period 5 is on page 4. Oh, that's everyone telling me. Let's get to Coxey's army. And Coxey's army has got to be, we're on page 5, aren't we? Near the bottom of page 5? Well, I'll go ahead and do that, even though I kind of wanted to get more of these other things before, but let's go and do it. So Coxey's army, that's during the horrible panic of 1893, and Jacob Coxey, who actually wasn't doing that badly business-wise, but he saw the mass number of unemployed, and he believed that the best way to get out of that would be for the government to create jobs. If the government creates jobs, that will put money into people's hands and trigger demand. Demand will get the economy going. So that was his idea. Give people jobs, massive numbers of unemployed, and go from there. And so he was hoping for about 100,000, turned out to be just a few thousand, but people from all over the United States began to go to Washington, D.C. to demand that Congress would help people with jobs. And this actually is not revolutionary. This was actually was pretty mainstream thinking in 1873, just no one had the guts. But by 1893, when Coxey got to Washington, D.C., the overwhelming philosophy of virtually everybody in Congress, Republican and Democrat, especially the Democratic president Grover Cleveland, was social Darwinism. And we can't help these unemployed. It's their fault they're unemployed. And so they not only did not pass, well, it actually, one bill did pass the House, but it failed in the Senate, and Coxey would be arrested for walking on the grass. And the movement would break down. Because there just weren't that many. These were starving, desperate people. They weren't revolutionaries. But it looked like the chance of revolution. And so Coxey's army would have that symbol, that idea that it could happen, that fear of revolution. And this will be a big tool for the populists, but then the progressives. If we don't reform capitalism, there'll be a revolution. I'm just thinking, wow, we might be living in that right now. And next. Oh, don't forget too, Coxey's army walking to Washington, D.C. for reform. It's directly referenced in The Wizard of Oz. All those people marching on, or all those people, the travelers marching on the yellow brick road for reform. That represented Coxey's army. So where are we at here? Carnegie and Rockefeller, and that's on page 5? Yeah. Carnegie and Rockefeller, those were two of the most famous robber barons. And robber barons was a kind of derisive nickname given to the new kind of capitalists. And the new kind of capitalists, let's just get robber barons really quick. These new kinds of capitalists were not people who were the inventors or the creators who had this innovation to make something and create something. The new type of capitalist in the 1870s, 1880s through today were people who could see someone else's innovation, take it, steal it, buy it, usually steal it, and then they can organize the money to create the capital to make the business. That's the new type of robber baron. And the whole point is that's why I use steal. They'll use any tool they can to get more market share and grow their business for profit. And so it's these robber barons that will aggressively use the powers of monopoly to drive out competitors. These are, and the two of the most famous would be Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller. Today, robber barons would be Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates. Those are examples of robber barons today. But Andrew Carnegie. I'm just looking down my thing. Andrew Carnegie, he would start Carnegie Steel, and he would develop the best example of vertical integration was Andrew Carnegie at Carnegie Steel. He would aggressively drive out competitors or buy up all the iron mines and make sure his competitors could not get iron unless they paid a premium, thus driving them out of business. He would make railroads or buy out railroads or buy stock in railroads to make sure he got good deals on that and owned the steel mills. And when he sold his Carnegie Steel to a consortium by the financier J.P. Morgan, it would be the richest man in the world and would have almost $1 billion. At that time, it's unimaginable wealth. That would be hundreds of billions of dollars today. To try to get an idea of the wealth, but he would, for example, do everything to drive out the unions, like at the Homestead strike in 1892, where he would destroy the labor union just so he could have more profit. John D. Rockefeller, he would do the same thing in oil, and he is the best example of his company, Standard Oil. And with it, he not only did vertical integration to try to buy or control all the iron mines and then the railroads to ship the oil, he also would invest in pipelines and the transmission centers. But the big thing Rockefeller did is he aggressively destroyed every other refinery, and that's why his company would be known as the Octopus. Next, innovation. Oh, innovation. The big thing I put down about innovation, I'm talking about all the new inventions, all the new technological changes of the second industrial revolution. And don't forget, innovation builds on other innovation. And so a lot of the brilliant, innovative things that came out of the late 1890s into the 19th century that made our world today are standing on the shoulders of the steam engine and those kind of things. Because without steam power, the idea of electricity is silly. So don't forget, innovation builds on other innovation. No one's going to invent a wheel unless you have something to pull it. But the big innovations would be, one of the biggies would be the new Bessemer process to make steel. Another one would be the electric dynamo, which would be invented by David Faraday, but then you get alternating current. That would be kind of invented by Tesla, but taken by Westinghouse to really use AC, alternating current, to get electricity. In fact, that's the biggie. Electricity is the big innovation. And so electricity is the big innovation. Other examples would be refrigerated cars by Armour and Swift. And refrigerated cars changed the entire way people got food. Now they became more centralized location, allowed for bigger businesses. This, I mean, changed the world. Another big element would be the internal combustion engine, which would radically change society. Another big innovation would be the airplane by the Wright brothers in 1903. And another big innovation, and this is more generic, the new chemical industry, really got to start in Germany, the DuPont family, United States. In fact, when you look at the second industrial revolution, it's building on this, but the innovations are going to be focused around electricity, internal combustion engine and petroleum, and chemicals. Oh, I should add one more innovation, the corporation. Where are we at here? Black soldiers in the 54th Massachusetts. So that's in the middle of page 4. Black soldiers. And just one sec. Good, it's still recording. I got a little note saying it wasn't recording. So, black soldiers. And with the Emancipation Proclamation, the United States started actively recruiting black soldiers. And by the end of the war, 1 out of every 10 Union soldiers were black. In fact, the vast majority were former slaves. And the big thing about black soldiers, they were fighting not just for freedom and not just to free their families. They were fighting to show that they deserve equal citizenship in this United States. That's why Frederick Douglass fought so hard to get blacks into combat. And a similar thing would happen 80 years later in World War II, fighting for equality, where black soldiers were segregated in laborers. And the 54th Massachusetts was the first, oh, I almost forgot, they're all segregated. Black enlisted men and white officers. But the 54th Massachusetts was the first segregated, they called them colored regiments, that fought in a major battle in the Civil War. It's tried to storm Battery Wagner outside of Charleston on blockade duty. And 40% would be killed or wounded in this assault, including their commander, a white abolitionist named Gould. But just a sec, another thing popped up on my screen. I can't see, just something popped up. But the 54th Massachusetts, and showed that the medal of black soldiers, and that they could fight. One thing about the 54th, unlike the vast majority of so-called colored regiments, they were almost all freed blacks who had been in Massachusetts as freedmen. Next, conscription in New York draft riots. So the United States tried to fight the Civil War, and it's right about black soldiers, with volunteers. But it was clear by 1863 they're going to have to start conscription, which is, we call it the draft. And they would call, the first draft calls would happen right after the Battle of Gettysburg. Bad timing with all the casualties there. But conscription would be, it would definitely favor the rich. Wealthy people could either pay $300 or hire a substitute. So this definitely favored the rich. And so it mostly drafted poor workers to go fight. And in New York, this would trigger a draft riot. And it was a massive, one of the biggest class conflicts in American history, where thousands of people, most of them poor areas of New York, would protest against the draft. They said, thousands die at Gettysburg, now you're in the army. And so these are people who were finally starting to get the best jobs they ever had, and now they have to go fight. And so there was a lot of resentment against the very wealthy who could avoid it. People like Andrew Carnegie could avoid the draft. He paid and got out of it and got rich. But also there's a severe element of racism, the idea that we're going to go fight and die to free slaves who will come north and take my job. So much of the element of racism is I will lose my place in society. That's where I have to add this. If you go to the 1920s, we talked about the new conservative era and fundamentalism. Racism is a very conservative feeling. It's the idea that I'm going to lose my place. Let's go back to where people knew their place, aka I'm on top over you. Okay. Agrarian problems. Wow, we're doing a lot. Where's agrarian problems? Oh, top of page 6. So the agrarian problems, and these really start to happen. You could see it before the Civil War, but really after the Civil War. And the agrarian problems were this. First off, you have all these new farmers, small farmers. Remember, the goal of the American dream, at least up to the 1930s, was to own that farm and to be an independent farmer where you're beholden to nobody. But these were the problems then on the farm. First one was massive amounts of debt. Debt. Farmers are always in debt, and therefore there's going to be a big anti-bank feeling, which would lead to that prejudice against Jews, where you have this false idea that Jews run all the banks. But debt. Next, massive overproduction. And remember, overproduction drops prices because you produce more of what people need, and therefore prices tank. We're seeing that right now. We're going to see a combination of overproduction and also shortages right now. I'm sorry, I was just thinking about the current economic situation because I have to do a little bit of this for special topics. And it's amazing how some of these things all cycle around. But overproduction, the biggest reasons for overproduction, more land in production, but also one of the biggies, new technology. New technology. You have all these mechanization like the mechanical reaper, and then by the end of the century, things like tractors and new windmills for pumping. But because of these mechanization, more production. And so production drops cost. And so only if prices are dropping, the only way farmers can get out of debt is to produce more to try to make up the difference, which is a horrible cycle. It should remind you of the boom bust. But that also leads to more debt. The next big problem was anger at the railroads. Railroads have monopolies. They would charge more for areas they had a monopoly and also charge more to small farmers. And so they were at the mercy of railroads. They're at the mercy of monopolies. Another big agrarian problem was deflation. There was government policy was to limit the money supply with the gold standard. With deflation, prices dropped, farmers couldn't pay back their debt. That's why they wanted inflation. That's where you get the free silver. Another problem with farmers were high tariffs. High tariffs were meant to protect big industry or big farms, but it raised prices for farmers, thus increasing their debt. And another big issue, another big agrarian problems is that small farmers felt there was no political party that would meet their needs. And so that's why they try to form groups like the Grange to do something about lack of political representation. But all these agrarian problems would lead to this, literally a prairie fire that would start growing to eventually just put an arrow to the Populist Party. Next, Carpetbaggers and Scalawags. Oops. So that should be at the top of page 5. Carpetbaggers and Scalawags. So carpetbaggers, that was the derogatory nickname. So this nickname was meant to insult people from the North who came south after the Civil War. Most of the people who came south were part of the Freedmen's Bureau to educate and help former slaves, which you can imagine a lot of Southern whites resented. But there were some Northerners who came south to take advantage of the bad economy so they could buy up land cheap. And so this would become a derogatory nickname for Northerners coming down to exploit the South. And this would become a big part of the Reconstruction myth, saying that Reconstruction was like an invasion of the North, an invasion by the North of the South. And so carpetbaggers are still used today. So somebody from another state comes into, let's say, Montana and tries to run for office. They're from another state, but they're rich, they come into Montana, so they could be called a carpetbagger. Not just Montana, obviously other states. Scalawags were the derogatory nickname that Southern whites gave to Southerners who became Republicans. They were called scalawags. And as they saw it, remember that idea that Republicans, that was the party of Lincoln, therefore the party of the Civil War, the party that won the Civil War and trying to give rights to former slaves. And so that's what they called scalawags. The most famous one would be probably General Lee's best officer in the Confederate Army, James Longstreet, who had to flee the South because he not only sympathized with Northern Republicans, he would become part of the Grand Administration, could never go back to his home state of Virginia. So those are scalawags. And the first Reconstruction governments, Southern whites who would eventually become Democrats because Lincoln was a Democrat, they stayed out of these Reconstruction governments. And a lot of the Reconstruction governments would become dominated by former slaves and whites who they called scalawags. And they would try to bring equal rights and protection to former slaves. And these Reconstruction governments would be attacked after Reconstruction as being corrupt. And that's what happens when you give those people rights. Either blacks can't govern because they're uncivilized, that goes back to the positive good theory, or the scalawags and carpetbaggers would take over because they're thieves. Next, where are we at here? I've already answered the conscription and draft riots. So you already got that, Megan. So you're not, you already got that. So sharecropping. Okay, so just below end of Reconstruction, tenant farming and sharecropping. This is a really important thing to happen after the South, after the Civil War in the South. After the Civil War, there's no money in the Civil War, or no money in the South, and but there's two big things that happen. First off, the big landholders, they still had land, but they had no money and no labor. Former slaves were given nothing but their freedom. They have nothing, literally nothing. Nothing has ever been given to former slaves, for the most part, for what the hell they went through to this day. It's actually kind of remarkable, but they had nothing. And so at first, the landlords began to rent out the land to former slaves, but also poor whites. And this is not a new thing. Obviously, it's happened for as long as there have been big landlords, but they were called tenant farmers. But the problem with tenant farmers were that they could never really pay back their rent, and more they would go into debt to the landlords. So tenant farmers, they went into debt, and they had to do what you might remember this called a debt or a crop lien, where they started to have to put their crop up as collateral to pay back their debt, and pretty soon the landlord is just taking the crop. And so tenant farmers became trapped in debt. They couldn't get out of debt. And that would evolve, or devolves a better term, into sharecroppers, where their rent went from being money to crop. And they must give a percentage of their crop to pay for rent. And the landlords then will control what crop they grow. And therefore, they're taking more and more of their crop, and the sharecroppers have less and less that they're growing and selling, and so they're even in more debt. And so sharecropping became a way to control poor people in agrarian areas, almost all former slaves, but a significant number of people who weren't slaves. They became trapped in debt and basically owned. But the big difference was, unlike slavery, the landlords didn't have to technically care for the slaves. They could say that the sharecroppers are independent. They're independent contractors is what they would say today. So they're responsible for themselves. All they want is their sharecrop. And this became another form of slavery and one of the big elements of Jim Crow laws. So see below, Jim Crow laws were laws that said sharecroppers and tenant farmers couldn't leave the land until they paid their debt. Since they could never pay their debt, they're slaves. That is a big part of Jim Crow laws. Next, Populist Party and Omaha. And so that's in the middle, or near the top of page 6. And that was the result of all those agrarian problems. The result of all those agrarian problems was the Populist Party and the creation of the Populist Party. And originally, its actual name is called the People's Party. But the Populist Party was this conglomeration of the old Knights of Labor and some socialists, the Greenback Party that wanted inflation. But the biggest elements of them were farmers. Farmers were the biggest element of this, and also miners, mine operators. And the Populist Party platform would be a massive platform of reform, and they wanted to reform capitalism to save capitalism. Reform capitalism to save it. Reform it. And even though some were socialist leaning, without a doubt. And their big elements that they wanted, first off, was the idea of social morality. That we as a community have a responsibility to all people. We have this responsibility. And that means government, which speaks for the people, has a responsibility to all. Because if we don't care for all, that might lead to revolution. You see a similar thing happen in Europe after World War II, for example. And the New Deal was an example of this. The New Deal is an example up to the 1980s or 1970s. There was the idea we have a responsibility to all. It's not happening right now. But the other big elements is they wanted inflation. They wanted inflation, which means they wanted to print more currency, and they wanted free silver. They wanted to coin silver paid for by the United States government, so free silver. Next, they wanted to, they were pro-labor union. Next, they wanted progressive taxation, so higher progressive income tax, which was unconstitutional at that time. So progressive income tax as rates get higher, as incomes get higher. They also wanted direct election of senators, and they also wanted more government regulation and control, maybe even government takeover of some of the most important industries. Specifically railroads, electricity. They could see electricity was going to become so important, which, wow, is it ever? We couldn't have, for example, any kind of class right now if not for electricity. We are so dependent upon it. And they said telegraph and the new form of telephone. Government's probably going to have to take those over, because if we're reliant upon those for survival by companies who want profit, they will squeeze people. Just like people who try to hoard toilet paper. They'll hold those things that people need and then charge as much as possible. Once again, they are visionaries. Think about how the new communications measures. This class is dependent upon a company that we have to pay money for. And that's a monopoly for communication. That was the Populist Party. And this would become the basis of the Progressive Party and the New Deal. And populist reforms, so many of them would happen in the New Deal. And so this is closer to liberal economics, very close to liberal economics. Some are even outright close to socialism. Next, where we are, the ICC. ICC. Okay, there was no regulation of railroad rates, but in the 1870s, individual state Grange, those are farmers' organizations called the Grange, they passed, or they used their influence to get state governments to pass laws regulating railroads. So this is talking about regulating railroad rates. But the Supreme Court threw those out because of interstate commerce, the Wabash Railroad cases. These were thrown out because railroads crossed state lines in the Wabash Railroad case. And so there became a huge clamor by 1887 to have some kind of regulation of railroad rates, especially by farmers, because the Granger laws were thrown out. So you need national level reform. The Interstate Commerce Act would create the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, that would regulate railroad rates. And the law said no more price fixing, no price discrimination, so railroads couldn't use their monopoly powers to squeeze small businesses or small farmers, which are businesses. But the law was written in such a way that the ICC had no power to enforce. And very quickly, the railroads realized, let's support this. And then we'll get railroad men, like railroad lawyers, on the ICC. Heck, the guy who said that, Richard Olney, would eventually become the Attorney General to President Grover Cleveland. The whole thing is fixed. And so the ICC promised to do something and then infuriated farmers and put an arrow there that would directly lead to the Populist Party. We need our own political party. And we know anything about internet right now. We see this kind of stuff happening right here. Bleeding Kansas. Where's that at? It's got to be here. Has to be on page 4. Yeah, about halfway through page 4 on the right, if you're looking at the piece of paper on the right. Bleeding Kansas. Okay, Bleeding Kansas. Did I skip Harper's Ferry? Let me come back to Harper's Ferry too, but Bleeding Kansas, that would happen after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And when the Kansas-Nebraska Act repealed the Missouri Compromise and said popular sovereignty in 2 new huge big territories, Kansas and Nebraska, and popular sovereignty meant that the people in the territories could decide whether or not they'll have slavery, whether or not they'll have slave codes, is what it really means. That would trigger a civil war in Kansas between pro-slavery people called border ruffians, because so many came from across the border from the state of Missouri, border ruffians who were pro-slavery, and anti-slavery people called free soilers. Remember, free soil meant no slavery in the territories. No slavery in the territories. And this civil war would, in many ways, be the precursor to the Civil War. And there'd be some bloody fights, and that is where John Brown would make his first appearance, that after border ruffians sacked the free soil town of Lawrence, Kansas, he and his followers would butcher 5 pro-slavery people at Pottawatomie Creek. And that's when John Brown would become a symbol of the free soil movement. He would also fight off border ruffians at Osawatomie Creek. This is a civil war, essentially. And so it's hard to really say who is a hero and who's a villain, who is fighting for freedom and who's a terrorist. It really depends on what you're side on. But Bleeding Kansas is where it would start. And the big controversy would be the Topeka Constitution, which would be free soil, and the Lecompton Constitution, that would be pro-slavery. Eventually, the Topeka Constitution would be ratified, pro-slavery. Next. Oh, let me do John Brown then real fast. So John Brown in 1859, already famous from Bleeding Kansas, he decided with some help of some abolitionists in the North, even Frederick Douglass listened to him, to start a slave rebellion by taking the federal armory at Harper's Ferry. He probably didn't want to start a real slave rebellion, knowing how awful that would be. But this slave rebellion, the fear of slave rebellion was the North's greatest fear. And sorry about that. Oh, I'm sorry, not the North's greatest fear. Something popped up on the screen, my mind flew. The South's greatest fear. Now, the rebellion did not happen. Brown did not leave Harper's Ferry. There weren't very many slaves in that area of Northern Virginia, which is now West Virginia. It's mountainous. There's no plantations. So nobody joined the rebellion. Slaves knew what happened to people who rebel. They remember, they know. But this and he would be executed, but he would become a symbol of the fight. And to many Southerners, he became the villain they all feared. John Brown represented all Northerners. More specifically, he represented the new Republican Party. And the Republican Party might say they're not anti-slavery, they just are free soil, but to them, they're all John Browns coming to cut their throat in the middle of the night. Yet to many Northern free soilers and abolitionists, here is a man who's finally going to stand up to Southern bullying, which, let's be clear about it, that Southerners bullied all the time. Remember Sumner Brooks. And remember Sumner Brooks, which happened during the Bleeding Kansas affair, where Sumner was beaten nearly to death by Preston Brooks, a Southerner on the floor of the United States Senate, Sumner Brooks. That's a good Bleeding Kansas reference. Boy, that'd be a great bit of outside information. But many Northerners went to war marching in their new blue uniforms to fight for liberty and union, singing John Brown's body. And don't forget, if you look up above, let me just get this real fast. Free soil ideology is really important. Free soil ideology says, and this became the Northern idea, that the Northern system of free labor, where all workers can sink or swim on their own merit, regardless of who they are, that system of capitalism must spread to the territories. And the Southern system of slavery deprives people of opportunity. Why would anybody move to a Southern state? Because nobody wants to compete against slaves for jobs. And therefore, the Northern system, this dynamic system, must spread. Don't forget, when I didn't mention this in the causes of the Civil War, but the vast majority of Northerners were not anti-slavery. They were free soil. They're like, you could have your slaves in South Carolina, I just don't want it to spread west. But to Southerners, they think they're all a bunch of John Browns. That's why when you look at Southern ideology and free soil ideology, it's all about slavery in the territories. It's not necessarily about slavery in states that already exist. So you might want to put an arrow or something from the causes of the Civil War up to that ideology, because those ideologies would define the differences, but also lead to Southerners freaking out when a Republican's elected. I'm to my last one. Sound good? Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation. So Antietam was Robert E. Lee and the Confederates' desperate attempt to invade the North, win a big victory to get Britain into the war. And it failed. It failed, and they were, well, General McClellan had many opportunities to destroy the Confederate Army. He didn't destroy the army, but pushed them out of Maryland. And it was enough of a victory for Abraham Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln needed a victory, so he didn't look desperate. And the Emancipation Proclamation was a military decision. And he said Congress gave him this power to put down the rebellion, to free slaves in areas of the rebellion. Didn't free slaves anyplace else, only in areas that were under control of the Confederacy. And it would take place on January 1st, 1863. Antietam was September 17th, 1862. So in 1863, it take place. So give the South a little bit of time to come to their senses. And it on the surface, a very moderate bill. You know, it was pretty cautious. But this changed everything. Once the Emancipation Proclamation took effect, the war for the North went from not just Union, but to Union and liberty. He gave the North a huge cause, and allowed for the recruitment of black soldiers. But because of this, once this was issued and took effect, slavery's dead. Once the fight became against slavery, slavery can't come back. This allowed for the recruitment of black soldiers, And once it became a fight against slavery, Britain will never enter the war on the sides of the Confederates. And if Britain won't go, France won't go. So the Confederates are isolated. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation was such a big deal. Wow, did I cover a lot. And I hope you got a lot out of this. I never did stop. I just got on a roll. So I'll tell you what I'm doing. I'm going to put out a couple things that you can read. The practice DBQ, but also the list of the different eras, but to try to get some of the context in. Because you have to get background material, context, things outside your essay that are happening at that time. If your essay question for the DBQ is about the events leading up to the Civil War, and you're going to talk about, you know, different ideologies and the election of 1860 in your body paragraphs, in the context, you add things like the Industrial Revolution. You add things like the Dred Scott decision, or abolitionist, or positive good theory. You know, things outside your body, you need context. That is a point. That's 1 point, and you only have 7 total. If you don't have context, if you just start, you know, pontificating about the world will forever change in some dramatic opening, you won't get the point. So I'm going to give you this thing on context and something on another form, even though we've talked about it many times about writing a DBQ. And don't forget, if you feel like you wanted, or if you want to get some additional points to improve your DBQ, I'll give you a chance if you give me an outline, opening paragraph, and one of your body paragraphs. Outside information. Outside information. Okay, so if there's no more questions, anything? Nobody wants to talk? Nobody wants to say anything? All right, I will make sure this is on Teams. So I'll post it, and I'll also upload it to YouTube. So it'll be on the YouTube.
Are we doing another one of these?
Yeah,
Before
we'll do another one. I originally scheduled it for Monday, and I think I'm going to keep it on Monday, and so that will give us a few days. So if we want to have one or part of one on Wednesday. And next week, I'll set aside a couple times in the evening where I will just have my computer on. I'll just have the computer on. And so I will always be checking Teams. Maybe I'll open up a chat room someplace or a chat in YouTube or something. So if you have any questions, you can ask them. But I will have another one on Monday about the same time, but same deal. I have meetings. It might be a little bit late. I will let you know when I find out. Any other questions? All right, that's it. Enjoy your lunch.
We shall. Thanks for doing this, Mr. Partridge.
You bet. I hope it helped.
Mm-hmm.
Bye.